Good afternoon. My name is Javed Malik, and I welcome you to another episode of the Ambassadors Dialogue. This is, of course, an initiative of the Ambassador Partnership, which is an international forum based out of London that brings together more than 40 ambassadors from different countries around the world. In today's program, we will be speaking about the emerging opportunities of Africa as it prepares to deal with the post-COVID environment and how it is preparing for economic recovery. Today, joining me in this discussion will be my colleague, Peter Collett, who is a former British ambassador. And joining us from Africa will be a former journalist and a commentator on Africa, Mr. Peter Burton. Good afternoon, gentlemen. So let us start with Mr. Peter Burdin, who's of course joining us from Africa. And of course, he's been living there for some time. He's a former BBC correspondent and an analyst and commentator on Africa. Peter, tell us about the way Africa has been dealing with this COVID crisis. Like the rest of us in the world, it is a challenge for them. But of course, it has also brought Africa together in a way. Do you think that would be a blessing in disguise, as many experts are saying?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, the whole world, as you say, is suffering. And I think with the possible exception of New Zealand, I think everyone has found this situation very challenging. I think what we've seen in Africa is that there is a body of knowledge and fear. We had the Ebola crisis, we've had Rift Valley fever, and I think African leaders saw very, very early on that this was something to be taken seriously, and I think they're reaping the benefits from that. I mean, very briefly, Ethiopia was monitoring people arriving at the airports back in January. At the beginning of February, the African Centre for Disease Control was set up and was starting to issue instructions on how people should prepare for the coming virus. And I think particularly when you look at the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, he was very, very quick, to lock down his own country after only 2 deaths, and then South Africa went into a pretty strict lockdown. But then he galvanized the rest of the African Union leaders, and he summoned virtually, of course, because of the lockdown, all the economic ministers, all the health ministers in Africa, and they continue to meet on a weekly basis to share information, share strategies, and indeed, in the case of Cameroon, share planes to some of the more impoverished African states to get areas out to the remote areas. So I think yes, I think Africa has taken it very seriously. They've been very, very well prepared. The wave is coming. We don't think it will peak as a virus in Africa until middle of August now. So they're not going to get out of this with unscathed, but I think they are they've used the time very, very well as they approach the peak of the virus a little later than the rest of the world.
Let me bring Peter Collett into the discussion. Peter, as you heard Peter Burdin speaking about how Africa has been dealing with it, with you sitting in London, you obviously been observing different countries and how they, look at this crisis and find opportunities in which they can recover themselves once this crisis is over. When you look at Africa, what do you see? Do you see the right steps being taken at the right time by the leaders?
Well, I mean, I'm no health expert, and Peter is on the ground and much closer to it than me. But my impression is exactly like Peter's, that quite surprisingly, because I think people thought, oh goodness, it's going to be a real disaster once this disease spreads to Africa. Quite surprisingly, they seem to have handled it very well, to have been organized and cooperative, as Peter says. And he mentioned South Africa, and I mean, South Africa has not been going through the greatest time economically or really politically for some while. But as far as this is concerned, they seem to have actually handled it extremely well. And for instance, in one area like the sort of whole testing and tracking and tracing, they seem to frankly have done a lot better than we've done in the UK. Partly because they have lots of people on the ground, a sort of a healthcare system, which is lots of people who are able to do this kind of tracking and tracing most efficiently. And also, as Peter says, a number of countries in Africa have had the experience of other pandemics, which they've really struggled with and had to deal with, but have come out the other side.
Yeah, Peter Burton, as we have looked at Africa and the challenges that it faces, of course, it is a region which is already viewed by many as a country, as a region which has a lot of economic challenges. Do you think that the healthcare system in Africa is capable of handling what you mentioned earlier, a possible wave or a peak that might hit it before we move towards the economic side? I just want to understand a little bit about how they are equipped to deal with the crisis once, if COVID becomes more advanced as it is at the moment in Africa.
Yeah, and I think it is difficult. We mustn't paint too rosy a picture. I think the African leaders' response has been very professional, has been very strong, and I think it's learnt from previous health crises. Like, there are literally tens of thousands of community health workers who fanned out from capitals into rural areas to do education, to do hygiene training, and to do screening and testing. And I think they've proved that screening and testing, if implemented early, does actually work. And I think, as Peter says, that certainly the South African screening system has proved effective. However, as we've always said, and we said before the beginning of this crisis, Africa's health systems are fragile. And we're starting to see that. I mean, even in South Africa, in Johannesburg, the Johannesburg hospitals are almost running at capacity. And the wave is just starting to hit. I was reading this morning that new cases in Africa increased by 24% in the last week. And that's going to increase at all. But I mean, so far, it's been restricted to 12,200 deaths, I think, across the entire continent, which is an impressive response. But I think it is the very fragility of those African health systems which has put African leaders on their mettle to realize we can't go for herd immunity, certainly.
Yes.
We can't let this happen. We've got to act quickly, and I think they have done. However, the tough days are coming, and I think the World Health Organization recognizes that as well. So they are braced for the worst days yet.
Yes. They say that sometimes the economic challenges or challenges in general, strengthen you to come together. And what we have seen in some cases is that African countries, which were previously, not seeing eye to eye on many issues, have somehow come together as the African Union, as it were. Many leaders have talked about reviving the African Union, strengthening in it. Do you think that this is something that might be temporary because of the challenge that they face, or is it something that they do feel is the need that they require to be able to build Africa for the future as we move towards our discussion, which will focus more on economic recovery and their own? So do you think African Union, as it were, might be strengthened as a consequence of this challenge?
I think we're certainly seeing that. I think the real test is what happens post-crisis. At the moment, the crisis has brought the African Union together. It's being very effective. It's not only managing the crisis, but it's helping each other. So the weaker African countries are getting support from the stronger ones. They signed an agreement where all 54 African states would have access to personal protective equipment and ventilators. So it's sort of Africa coming together to fight its corner. And actually, we're seeing situations where we're looking at the future. Cyril Ramaphosa, as the president of the African Union, has set up a post-crisis task team, and that's got some of the most senior leaders in Africa, people like Donald Kaberuka, the former president of the African Development Bank, and Trevor Manuel, who was very much a key person in African economic revival as well. They're now looking at plans of what kind of Africa emerges from this. I think if you look at the history of the African Union, and it was modeled on the European Union initially, almost taken off the shelf, I think the track record has not been strong. And people, I remember years ago when I was based in Nairobi, people used to wait for African Union initiatives and wait for them to be implemented. And very often you were waiting a long time. I think this is an opportunity to actually make the African Union, certainly people want it to work. Like anything, once the crisis is over, things tend to sort of slip backwards a little bit. But at the moment, the recipe is there for them to help create a new Africa out of these situations.
Certainly, the internal rifts between countries, and sometimes within countries, within the leadership of countries, and of course in the way that Africa is structured, the tribal system in some parts of Africa still exists, and that has been a contributing factor of not seeing eye to eye on many things. But do you think that some leaders have spoken about a Marshall Plan for Africa, which is something that we've seen in the past for Europe? Do you think that is something which is, again, more than likely, or is it something which is just wishful thinking?
It's a very good question. I mean, I was there at the World Economic Forum for Africa in Durban about 4 or 5 years ago, where the German government launched the Marshall Plan for Africa. And ever since, whenever I talk to colleagues in Germany, I say, "Can you tell me what's happening?" And they've never heard of it. So I think there is an element of wishful thinking. I mean, I think one stark economic fact about Africa is that African debt repayments are larger than what Africa spends on all its health systems across the continent. So they're spending more in repaying debts than they're spending on health. And actually, if they could be relieved of those debt payments, that would give a lot of money which could work towards a Marshall Plan. I think two interesting facts, actually, in that Africans have realized they're on their own. You know, America is no longer, America sees its role in Africa as countering the rise of China in Africa. And the European Union, I think, which has played a very good role, I have to say, in African development, is going through its own internal tensions.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I find that very interesting. I would like to ask you whether you said that, well, America has always been trying to look at various countries and regions to perhaps counter the Chinese influence. Do you think there might be a growing alliance between America and the African Union if it emerges, or within perhaps some countries within Africa in an effort to counter the influence that China has? Of course, China is already coming into Africa and supporting some countries and building its influence in the region. So I think there will be a sort of a rift between America and China, and Africa might become the playing ground?
Well, I think people are talking of a new Cold War. And as we know, the first Cold War was a pretty hot war in Africa because it was the battleground between Soviet and Western, yes, and Western rivalries. I mean, I think what's coming out of this is the realization that we're not, Africa is not seeing American leadership like we all have done for some generations. And I think Africa is thinking we have to be a bloc because there's no one else we can turn to. I think they're suspicious of China, but it's an irresistible rise. And I think they've got to find ways of working with China. America's stated foreign policy seems to be really, let's just resist China wherever it appears on the African continent. So I think these are difficult days, but I think the positive that comes out of it is an African realization that we need to stand up for ourselves. And,
yes,
and that is where the African Union could be, again, a unifying force.
Let me also bring Peter Collecott onto the discussion. You've heard Peter Burdin, and of course some of us living in the West and in the Middle East, we have an outside view of Africa. And sometimes it has been said that Africa always gets, or in the majority of cases, gets a negative media around the world, mainly for poverty and deprivation and lawlessness, whereas Africa, in fact, is a country or a land of opportunities. Do you think that the media has been unfair in depicting Africa in the way it is depicted in the West?
To a degree, Javed, yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think inevitably the media sort of picks up on the big story, the threats, the sort of immigration waves coming across the Mediterranean, etc. But I think that's countered to a degree by some of the other perceptions of Africa, and actually by the Africans which one sees either in the media or in real life. And there's a sort of,
yes,
there's also a feeling of that kind of dynamism. I mean, Africans, when you meet them, are tremendous people. I mean, they've got a lot of energy, they've got a lot of enthusiasm, they've got a lot of optimism about the future. And I think some of that comes through as well. And also then in the sort of cultural sphere,
yes,
the music has I think got a bit of an uplift over the last few years and has been seen as something vibrant and very interesting. I don't know very much about Burton, but that's my strong impression. Coming from places like
yes,
Mali, which people sort of almost neglected before. So I think it's very black. It's grey and sort of very differently shaded. The West's view of Africa. I mean, I think there's a certain degree of cynicism about the politics, but Africa is a big continent, and some countries have done rather well in embedding institutions, and others, frankly, have done less well, and that's very telling in the long term.
You've of course been a senior British diplomat. You've served as an ambassador in different countries. I would like to hear from you on your thoughts. How do you think Africa, either as a group, if African Union becomes a reality, or in some cases individually as countries, better engage with Europe and the Western world in order to as they move towards the economic recovery? What would be your advice to the African leaders as a former British diplomat?
That's quite a challenge. Well, I think what they really want is to be taken seriously.
Yes.
Because I think there is a tendency amongst European diplomats, maybe Brits in particular, to sort of revert slightly to, not particularly the sort of colonial ways, but the sort of, we are the aid givers and you are the aid recipients, etc. And I think they want to be taken seriously, and they have the capacity to do that. They also have quite a lot to offer in terms of their economic development, which could be incredibly useful as counterparts to what some companies in Europe are wanting to do. So I mean, my advice, I think, is to be open, to be frank. I guess not to overpromise, because that doesn't go down very well.
Yes.
But also to tell people what's going on, because I think, as you suggested, the impression sometimes is wrong from media reports, and they need to counteract that to a degree and tell them some stories of success, as well as some stories of difficulties and corruption and whatever else comes out in the press.
And those, if I may
please.
I mean, one thing which points to that success is, one reason that there's only been 12,000 deaths in Africa isn't just down to African leadership acting early. It's also down to basic demographics. In that this is a very young continent. The average age of a person in Africa is 18 years old. In Europe, it's something like 45 years old. And as we know, this virus tends to be affecting people of an older generation with underlying health concerns. And so maybe one reason why Africa health-wise in this crisis is proving resilient is that it is a very young population. Now I'm on the board of something called the African Leadership University, and I deal with hundreds and hundreds of young Africans who are ambitious. A lot of them are setting up their own companies, and they're doing e-learning, distance learning, they're doing health things. Someone in Sierra Leone has just invented a $1 screening program and contact tracing, and they're using.
So there are some success stories and some good stories that need to be better highlighted, and I think this is what takes me back to Peter Collecott, and I've just want to ask him that Ambassadors Partnership as an institution or as a forum of diverse expertise of so many ambassadors working together, how can the ambassador partnership perhaps facilitate in sort of better improving the image of Africa to the West and the Western world, and B, to perhaps advise governments and perhaps even the private sector in better engaging with Europe? Do you think ambassadors partnership can play a role in that?
Well, I'm sure we could. I mean, the opportunity would be a great thing. But I think we've tended to work, if you like, on behalf of companies outside Africa, talking to Africans about particular problems which they have. But maybe from that, one can develop, in a sense, the sort of links the other way, and gain the confidence of African business and of African governments, that maybe we have something to offer in terms of how they can interact with European and other Western counterparts. Sure, I think it would be a great opportunity if we could.
Do you think, Peter Burton, do you think that is possible? Do you think they would perhaps welcome such an idea with the ambassadors partnership, with its diverse experience of more than 40 ambassadors working in different countries around the world, lending advice and perhaps facilitating in not only building the right image, I wouldn't say good, but the right image of Africa, because I sometimes do feel that it is wrongly projected, and also in trying to facilitate in economic recovery process. Do you think there is an opportunity there for us to work together with them, with some of the countries at least?
I think very much so. I think the Ambassador Partnership is very well positioned. As I say, the world and his wife is beating its door to Africa. Africa's problem, and they're aware of it, is, forgive my language, they don't want to get screwed again, which they were throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So I think a group of experienced people like the Ambassador Partnership are there. I mean, Africa has always had weak institutions or institutions that could do with bolstering. So governance is a key issue, and that's where the ambassadors are particularly strong, but also in the network, so that when these are honest brokers who are going to work very much side by side with their African counterparts. I think we all accept that the old days of the colonials coming in and telling locals what to do are over, thank God. But actually there is still a role for people who have got a global perspective, who can work alongside their African counterparts to really massive opportunities. I'll just give you one example, if I may, which is the African Free Trade Association, which is all 54 Africans have signed up for, delayed by the coronavirus, but will come on stream in January. And that really is a massive opportunity to increase intra-African trade. So traditionally, African markets have tended to be, they've exported to the West or they've exported to Asia. But actually the room for growth from Africans trading with fellow Africans across African borders is ginormous. At the moment it's 16%. In something like the European Union, it's 60-something%. So I think just that alone, and the ambassadors coming in to negotiate those kind of relationships state to state, I think is ginormous. I mean, I work in Africa as much as I do because I believe there is a great future. Many people call Africa the final frontier, by which they mean it is the last continent of great opportunity. And I know India is...
That actually brings me, sorry to interrupt you, that brings me to my final question because of the paucity of time, although discussion is very lively and we would like to carry on, but perhaps we might do another episode. But on this occasion, I'm sort of limited with time. But I would like to definitely ask one important question, which is about the opportunities that Africa offers. Now, we have always heard about Africa, as you mentioned, as being the very important continent in this world, but we are sometimes not very clear on what opportunities that might be. And perhaps if British or European or other countries around the world, especially from the private sector, so businesses and private businesses want to do business with Africa, what would you say are the areas in which they can explore opportunities in building a positive partnership with African counterparts for a collective economic recovery and also obviously doing business with Africa?
I think the attractive thing about Africa is that Africa needs everything. You know, that 60% of Africans do not yet have access to electricity or power. What an opportunity it is for power, for renewable energy as we combat climate change. There is so much demand in Africa that if you're a business, it is the place to be. Renewable energy, e-learning. You know, my campuses have been closed down for the time being, so everyone is moving onto Zoom and doing online distance learning. Great opportunities there. Local supply chain. I mean, traditionally, I think one of Africa's weaknesses has been it's a land rich in minerals and resources, which all get exported and then manufactured elsewhere. Actually, to grow an African manufacturing base is a potential game changer. And that's a game changer for the Africans, and it's a game changer for international business leaders wanting to come in and work alongside to that effect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And Peter, if you want to add anything to that and perhaps your perspective on the situation?
No, I mean, just very briefly, I just wanted to add that I think Peter's absolutely right, but I don't think it's entirely a one-way stream because as he said earlier, there are lots of very dynamic, very well-educated Africans who have actually things to contribute, often in the sort of digital area, which is a talent pool which actually should be tapped into for the benefit of Africa and also for the benefit of other commercial entities.
And if I may just add finally on that we spoke about media and images of Africa. Little known fact, there are over 600 innovation hubs throughout the continent. And these are young people all coming up with new ideas, and they need funding, but that is the beginnings of profitable partnerships for everybody.
Yep.
Well, let's hope that we can continue this discussion, and hopefully as the world prepares to come out of this COVID crisis and look at economic recovery, perhaps individually and as well as on the platform of the Ambassador Partnership, we can work together. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. Peter Burdin from Africa and Peter Collett from London. And until the next time, this is me, Javed Malik. And of course, we will be bringing you other episodes of the Ambassador Partnership. Until next time, have a good day.
The Ambassador Partnership. Access, engagement, resolution.